Everyone, and good morning. Should I say? Yeah, it's still morning. Good morning. It's really good to be here. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy for your consistent work on this very important theme. It is also a very relevant theme to Syria, and I hope that we can get into some of that today. Haris, I'm also biased. You are 100% my favorite moderator as well. When the organizers reached out to me, they asked me to offer an honest assessment of the situation on the ground, given that I've spent considerable time on the ground the past 6 months, but also to talk about where things are headed. I think Wael has done a very good job, my colleague Wael has done a very good job of speaking to maybe the geopolitics of Syria, how interests align or diverge. Maybe I should help you zoom in a little bit on this moment and what it means for Syrians. So a couple of points. Number one, I think we need to take a step back and just appreciate how meaningful this moment is for Syrians. And I'm going to talk from my own personal experience. I was born under Hafez al-Assad, and I spent most of my early adulthood under Bashar al-Assad. The Assads were all we knew. I had to, when I was a second grader, I skipped first grade. When I was a second grader, I was automatically added to a Tala'i al-Ba'ath, which is like literally translated as the vanguard of the Ba'ath party. I was in the second grade. I didn't even know what that was. I remember seeing this huge portrait of Hafez al-Assad and being told that I was now Tala'i, like a member of this vanguard. Same when I was in middle school, Shabib al-Thawra, the youth of the Ba'ath party. In college, of course, you also have to. So this was not just a political system that was based on authoritarianism. This was also a cult of personality, and it was all we knew. Now imagine all of that crumbling, this whole edifice crumbling. Imagine hearing the news saying Bashar al-Assad has fled Damascus. This was an Allahu Akbar moment for all Syrians. And for those who are not too intimately familiar with that, this was a hallelujah moment for Syrians. This was huge. This was epic. It was incredible. And so Syrians celebrated for months, and I think we're still celebrating. Now, I was in Doha when that happened. I was attending the Doha forum because there was a lot of international diplomacy surrounding Syria at the moment, and the United States and the UK and Europe and other countries and Turkey and Russia convening to make decisions about what to do about the fact that those guys, like the current government now, at the time they were an army, they were on the verge of capturing Damascus. Should we allow that to happen? Should we not allow that to happen? What should be done about this? So of course we were there because we're advocates for Syria and we wanted to influence that conversation. Now that happens, I immediately lost interest in all these governments. I got on a plane, I flew to Beirut, and a car was waiting for me, drove over to Damascus. I'm from Damascus, born and raised. I had not been in Damascus for almost 15 years. I had been back in non-regime controlled areas a lot, in Aleppo, in Idlib, in the north generally, a lot, because we used to shuttle back and forth and work with folks on the ground, support civil society, local administrative councils and so forth. But I had not been back in Damascus for 15 years. Now, back to the moment of euphoria, people were euphoric. They were incredibly happy, even though, like, some of the people I ran into were in rags, literally in rags. The level of poverty, the level of immiseration, really language fails to capture how terrible the situation was. The cars from the 70s, the cabs, the taxis, incredibly small, very poor condition, clunkers basically. Nonetheless, people were happy. I was not surprised that they were happy because I understood and appreciated what that moment meant for Syrians. But The Economist, the magazine, was a couple of months ago they published a report saying, quote, Syrians are surprisingly upbeat. And for The Economist, this didn't make any sense because the economy is in shambles. I wouldn't say it was on the brink of collapse, completely collapsed a long time ago. People had not been paid, civil servants had not been paid salaries for months. Economically speaking, if that's all you're thinking about, it was beyond abysmal. But to us, Syrians, this was not surprising because this was an incredibly meaningful moment. Now, mixed with that euphoria and that happiness and that joy, of course, I also encountered a lot of anxiety. Because of the same reason, the situation was abysmal. No electricity. The electricity was, we had it an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. Transportation also very poor condition, and that has ramifications for your daily life. Going through daily life in Damascus, at least at the time, things have improved since then, but at the time was really, really hard. The things that you take for granted here, like taking a shower, I was not able to take a shower every single day, and I'm someone who likes to shower a lot. I was not, because it was incredibly cold. So Syrians have something called sobia, which is like a heating like stove. So you have that in your living room, but once you leave the living room, because there's no electricity, there's no central heating, it's like going to Siberia. If you want to go to the kitchen, it's like going to Siberia. If you want to go to the bathroom, it's going to Siberia. If you want to, like, you're going to have to heat up water. Okay, you're going to have to heat up water in order to take a shower. So the daily life incredibly tough. And so there was also a lot of anxiety about that, about the future, about the state of the economy. So that was my second point. So first point was the joy. The second point was the anxiety. Now, on top of what about the legacy the regime left? If we said that Syria at the moment is rising from the ashes, this would not be a figure of speech. Syria is literally rising from the ashes. And I say ashes because the country, or at least, large swath of the country was literally burnt by, to the ground through barrel bombs and chemical weapons and the like. The country, entire cities were razed to the ground. That's why millions of people fled the country. So the legacy of the regime is one of utter annihilation, utter destruction. You go to some neighborhoods just outside, I wouldn't say just outside Damascus, they're actually part of Damascus proper, like Jubar. It's a moonscape, like nothing standing. You go to Daria, you see also utter devastation. And I'm talking about parts of Damascus, let alone other parts of the country. If you take a trip from the north, from Idlib, all the way down to the south to Damascus, the most consistent thing you will see on your way down south will be destruction and destroyed buildings. Now, that destruction, of course, extends to state institutions themselves, also complete collapse of the state. This is what the new government inherited from the regime. I went to, just to give you an example, I was given a tour of Nufus. Nufus is the civil registry. That's where we record, births and marriages and divorces and the like. Very essential, basic service that Syrians need on a daily basis. Destroyed, computers broken, the machines to print IDs also broken or missing or stolen. To this day, it's been almost 6 months, to this day, the civil registry in Syria, especially in Damascus, I think throughout the country except for Idlib, still, if you have if you have a new baby, if you get married, if you get a divorce, you can't record any of that. So my attorney shared with me about a lady who recently had a divorce, but as far as the state is concerned, she's still married, so she can't move on with her life, and she's losing her mind. That's what he told me. She's losing her mind. If you get married and you have a spouse in Syria at the moment, and you need to do family reunion here, and you just can't, because the USCIS is going to ask you for a certain kind of document that the civil registry should issue. And this is just a small example of the utter devastation that the regime had wrought on the country. Now, this is literally what the government took over. Now, since then, I think the government has taken a lot of meaningful steps in order to improve a lot of these conditions. Today, for example, they signed, I think, what might be one of the biggest deals in Syria's history ever, a deal for the provision of electricity, I think worth almost $7 billion. with a consortium of companies, including an American company. So policy-wise, the state seems to be headed in the right direction. The state is very focused on the economy, and I saw that focus, singular focus on the economy during the early days. I was in Old Damascus, and I discovered, this was barely a couple of days into the liberation of Syria, and I discovered that I was in Old Damascus, and I ran into Naqib al-Saga, like the chief of the Guild of Jewelers, and I was asked, what is this guy doing here? And they told me he just had a meeting with the government. I was amazed. Within a couple of days, they were doing these meetings because they were interested in stabilizing, the prices of gold and silver and stuff like that. This was within a couple of days. I think if I had been in their shoes, I don't think I would have done that within a couple of days. I think I would have had other priorities. But I'm wrong and they're right, because, and this is very good news for the population. Especially when my first month in Damascus, really people couldn't care less who was in government. And they cared, at least most people I spoke with, I'm not talking about elite civil society activists and the like. Most people I spoke with, and I spoke to a lot of everyday citizens, couldn't care less who was in the presidential palace. And they cared the most about putting food on the table, because this was an issue, it was a struggle. They cared about not going to bed on an empty stomach and not shivering in the winter. Those were the priorities. Now, if you combine that with the current government's focus on the economy, the current government is very interested in proving its mettle. The current government is very interested in delivering, improving themselves. So in that aspect, this is very good news for the population. Now, just two final points. On top of all this destruction that I've shared about, Syria, and as Syria was trying to rise from the ashes, it's not like, they had access to an expressway, or things were easy and all you had to do was just make the good policy decisions. Making good policy decisions was 100% a part of it, but that was not enough. Why? Because of crippling economic sanctions, especially U.S. sanctions. Now, we're talking about sanctions that date all the way back to 1979. A whole labyrinth of sanctions, from designating the SST designation Syria as a state sponsor of terrorism, to the designation on the current government, to the Caesar Act, to the SALSA Act, the Syria Accountability Act, to so much more. I could go on and on about sanctions. So Syria was practically off limits. So here, as a community, the Syrian American community, over the past 14 years, because of our advocacy against the Assad regime, we had built this muscle. Now, we're not APAC, but we have built this muscle, and we put this muscle immediately to work, reaching out to senior lawmakers. We're talking very senior people in the Senate and the House. Of course, very consistent outreach to the administration that goes back to November of last year, to try and explain what's happening and also influence U.S. policy decision making. So I would say between the work that the community did, community and allies, of course, did in Washington, D.C., and the help that we got from MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia, and of course the president of Turkey, who spoke with Trump and asked him for help. President Trump asked President Erdogan for help with Ukraine, and in return, President Erdogan asked him for help with Syria, specifically with sanctions, and Trump said, I don't mind. And so now that most of these sanctions have either been lifted or suspended, Syria, to quote the current U.S. envoy to Syria, Tom Barrack, Syria, quote, is open for business. So today, as I address members of the Muslim American community, I'm going to use the same phrase: Syria is open for business. And one of the recommendations that we have for you is to go and invest. Go and invest, go visit, go talk to people. I think it would be remiss not to say that some parts within the Syrian American community feel that they have been let down by some parts within the Muslim American community, because Syria, was a controversial issue and lots of stakeholders, but we also had a lot of allies. So that's something we're going to be forever indebted to. But now that Syrians are happy and overjoyed and Syria is open for business, one of the things that we would love the Syrian American to do is to join in the moment, we have the same concerns that I get a lot of concerns from members of the Muslim American community who reach out to me and say, all these things are happening, maybe some of the sanctions are being lifted, but there's a price you guys are going to have to pay. And of course we're aware of that. And this is something that we're also trying to navigate, but what we need is help. If you feel that we're going to be blackmailed, if you feel that we're going to be subject to this bargaining process, then what we need is your support. And so the final point I'll make is about the current government. So I've already shared with you the current government, the priority is to prove itself, prove its mettle, focus on the economy. Keep in mind, last year, just a few months ago, we had a lot of armed groups in Syria. The current president has done a miraculous job so far of uniting. It's the term that's bandied about in Syria is Tawhid al-Bunduqiyya. He's done an amazing job so far so good, of bringing a lot of these disparate groups under the umbrella of the Ministry of Defense. Now, there's still a lot of work to be done. Things could still happen, down the road. But one thing we were deeply concerned about, as even in January, was a Libya-like scenario where you have, or Sudan. I think the president, who's a force of nature, has done a very good job so far of trying to conclude a lot of deals. The last big deal that all Syrians are anxiously anticipating is the deal with the SDF, and the SDF is the U.S. partner force in the northeastern Syria. That's majority Kurds. I think this is going to, if some sort of an agreement has been concluded, but the devil is in the details, and it's all about implementation. Now, if that happens, and the government is also able to persuade the Druze in the south, in southern Syria, then I think that whole issue of staving off a Libya-like scenario will have been taken care of. So I feel that we're headed towards, since you asked me about where we're headed towards having a very strong government. I think what we need to ensure, and that's also to some of the very legitimate points that Wael raised, we need to ensure that we maintain a very strong civil society. Okay, one of the gentlemen here, who I think said that he was based in Turkey earlier today, talked about power, sweet power. I couldn't agree more with you. And so I think that's why it's very important to maintain a very strong civil society, to have checks and balances. That task, I think, falls to us, falls to people in Syria. But to get there, yes, of course, that's the political life. Having political life is very important. But I think to get there, and I'm going to conclude on this point, to get there, we need to ensure that we're empowering the civilian population. Some people, unfortunately, some very misguided voices, wanted to demand these things through using sanctions as a leverage. Sanctions should not be lifted unless we have political parties and democracies in Switzerland in a couple of months. I was vehemently opposed to that, because towards the end of my first month in Syria, even though I had a lot of money in my pocket, even though my family is not poor, even though I know I could go back to the United States anytime I wanted, towards the end of my stay the last week, I started acting like a local. I was jostling, because you can't help but because of daily life, you're just going through daily life, is really tough. And I was not staying at a hotel. If you're staying at a hotel, you have the lights on most of the day, and you have Wi-Fi. I was not staying at a hotel, I was staying at my family's home, and again, we're not poor. But simply, energy is scarce. So by going through daily life, and it's like you become less focused on Jeffersonian democracy, and you're like, I didn't want to hear anything about that. Like, I wanted to ensure that I was getting to places in time, and let alone people who didn't have access to the resources that I had. So what I'm trying to say here, and this is also to the Muslim American community, we need to ensure that all restrictions, there are a lot of restrictions that are still in place, like the export controls. There will be more good news coming down the pipeline, inshallah, very soon. But there are still things in place. We need everything lifted. We need the SST designation lifted, because we need to empower the population, because the population is the best bet for an inclusive future. Thank you.